On March 30th, 2026, two papers landed within hours of each other. One from Google, one from a quantum computing startup nobody outside the field had heard of yet called Oratomic. And by the time cybersecurity researchers finished reading them, the internal deadline the entire internet security industry had been quietly planning around got moved up by 6 years. Cloudflare, the company that secures a significant fraction of global web traffic, publicly announced it was accelerating its own preparation deadline to 2029. A cybersecurity researcher there described it simply as a real shock, and added that the industry would need to speed up its efforts considerably in response. And buried in the details of how this result actually came together is something that should genuinely unsettle you, because the breakthrough wasn't just found by human researchers grinding through the math the old-fashioned way. Artificial intelligence played a direct, acknowledged role in getting there. One of the paper's own authors put it about as plainly as a scientist ever puts anything. There is no question that they used AI to accelerate this development. No question at all. So let's actually unpack what happened, why it matters far more than a typical quantum computing milestone headline, and why the timeline for something the security world has been treating as a distant, decades-away problem may have just collapsed. This is a real, sourced, still unfolding story, not a manufactured scare, and the details are stranger and more concrete than most of what gets called a tech breakthrough these days. To understand why this particular result landed like a gut punch, you have to understand the number everyone in the field had been quietly relying on for years as a kind of safety margin. Building a quantum computer capable of actually breaking the encryption that protects your bank account, your email, and essentially the entire architecture of internet security has always been theoretically possible. Nobody in serious research circles doubted that, in principle, a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running an algorithm called Shor's algorithm could factor the enormous numbers underlying RSA encryption, or solve the elliptic curve math underlying the encryption that protects most modern web traffic, banking systems, and even cryptocurrency wallets. The reassurance everyone leaned on was scale. Estimates floating around the field for years put the qubit count needed for a cryptographically relevant quantum computer at somewhere around 1 million physical qubits. Today's most advanced machines operate with somewhere in the range of 100 to a few hundred qubits. That gap, roughly 4 orders of magnitude, was the buffer. It's what let policymakers, banks, and standards bodies treat the quantum threat as something to prepare for calmly over a decade or two rather than an emergency. The new research from Oratomic, done in close collaboration with scientists at Caltech, blew a hole directly through that assumption. The paper, led by researcher Madeleine Kane, along with collaborators, including Caltech professors Manuel Endres and John Preskill, one of the most respected names in quantum computing theory, demonstrated that a cryptographically relevant quantum computer running Shor's algorithm might not need anywhere close to 1 million qubits. Their estimate, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 physical qubits, using a neutral atom architecture where individual atoms are trapped and manipulated with laser tweezers. That's not a modest improvement on the old estimate. That's a reduction of roughly 50 to 100 times. To put it in terms that actually land, the paper's own resource estimates suggest that a system built around 26,000 physical qubits could crack the discrete logarithm problem underlying the P256 elliptic curve, the encryption standard used to secure an enormous share of internet traffic in a matter of days. Factoring a full RSA 2048 key, the kind still widely used to secure sensitive systems, was estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 months of runtime on that same machine. Machines with those qubit counts are not sitting in a lab today, but they are no longer science fiction either. They're a hardware engineering problem with a visible, plausible path, rather than a number so large it functioned as an effective impossibility. The reason this jump was even possible comes down to a clever, almost counterintuitive trick buried in how the Oratomic team approached quantum error correction. And this is where the neutral atom approach they're betting on actually separates itself from the superconducting qubit machines that companies like Google and IBM have spent years building. Quantum bits, or qubits, are extraordinarily fragile. Unlike a classical bit sitting reliably at a 0 or a 1, a qubit exists in a delicate superposition state that collapses the instant it's disturbed by noise, heat, or interference from its surroundings. That fragility is why quantum computers need error correction at all, and traditionally, error correction has been brutally expensive in terms of qubit overhead. To get one reliable logical qubit, the kind you actually use to run a calculation, engineers have needed to bundle together dozens or even hundreds of noisy physical qubits working in concert to catch and fix errors as they happen. That overhead is the real reason the qubit counts needed for a useful quantum computer kept climbing into the millions in older projections. The Oratomic and Caltech team's contribution was a new error-correcting approach that takes advantage of something neutral atom systems can do that superconducting chips fundamentally can't: physically move the atoms around during the computation itself, using reconfigurable optical tweezers to rearrange qubits into new positions as needed, mid-calculation. By exploiting that physical reconfigurability, combined with high-rate error-correcting codes and a more efficient logical instruction set, the team found they could dramatically cut the physical-to-logical qubit ratio, essentially getting more usable computation out of far fewer raw qubits than anyone had modeled before. To really appreciate how big a jump this is, it helps to zoom out and look at where quantum computing actually stood just a couple of years ago. Heading into 2026, the field was still firmly in what researchers call the noisy intermediate-scale quantum era, machines with somewhere between 50 and 200 error-prone physical qubits, useful mainly for research pilots and narrow demonstrations, rather than anything resembling a production application. Gate error rates, meaning how often a quantum operation produces a mistake, sat stubbornly in a range that made anything beyond fairly shallow calculations unreliable. Qubits themselves stayed coherent, meaning stable enough to hold useful information for only microseconds to milliseconds before noise from their environment scrambled them. That fragility was the central engineering obstacle the entire field had been grinding against for years, and it's exactly why qubit count estimates for a genuinely useful, fault-tolerant quantum computer kept landing in the millions. You needed that many raw, noisy qubits just to build enough redundancy to get a small number of clean, reliable logical qubits out the other end. Google's own superconducting qubit processor, Willow, had already been making real, if slower and more incremental, progress on this exact problem before any of this Oratomic news broke. Researchers demonstrated that Willow's logical error rates dropped by roughly a factor of 2 for every increase in the size of its underlying error correction lattice. The first hardware scale proof that fault-tolerant quantum computing actually follows the improving with scale curves theorists had predicted for years, rather than just getting noisier as more qubits get added, which had been a real and reasonable fear. That was, on its own, considered one of the most important quantum computing results of the year. It's a useful comparison point, because it shows the field was already moving in the right direction before Oratomic and Google's cryptography papers landed. What those papers did wasn't invent progress out of nowhere. It was compress a trajectory that was already trending toward more efficient, less qubit-hungry fault tolerance, and pull the timeline dramatically closer than the superconducting qubit roadmap alone had suggested was coming. It's also worth understanding, at least at a high level, why Shor's algorithm is the specific piece of math that makes all of this a security problem, rather than just an academic curiosity. Modern RSA encryption keeps your data safe because multiplying two enormous prime numbers together is computationally easy. But doing the reverse, taking that enormous product and figuring out which two primes were multiplied to get it, is brutally hard for a classical computer once the numbers get large enough. A standard RSA 2048 key involves numbers so large that every classical computer on Earth working together would need longer than the current age of the universe to factor it through brute force. Shor's algorithm, developed by mathematician Peter Shor back in 1994, long before quantum hardware existed that could actually run it, showed mathematically that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could solve this exact factoring problem exponentially faster than any known classical approach, by exploiting quantum superposition and interference to essentially search through many possible factors simultaneously rather than one at a time. Elliptic curve cryptography relies on a structurally similar hard problem called the discrete logarithm problem, which a quantum computer running a related version of Shor's algorithm can also crack efficiently. For 30 years, this was a purely theoretical threat, mathematically proven but practically irrelevant, because nobody had anything close to the hardware needed to actually run Shor's algorithm against real-world key sizes. What changed this year isn't the math. The math has been sitting there, fully understood, since the 1990s. What changed is the estimate of how much hardware you'd actually need to point that math at the real world. Here's where the AI part of the story actually enters, and it's worth being precise about what that means, rather than letting it turn into vague AI did it mysticism, because the real story is more specific and, frankly, more interesting. According to reporting from Time, one of the key figures behind this breakthrough, Robert Huang, who had previously worked at Google's quantum AI division before leaving in 2026 to join Caltech and go on to co-found Oratomic, told a colleague, still at Google, that he'd started using AI tools in his research and was seeing what he described as a lot of crazy results. That comment, made informally months before the papers were public, was reportedly enough to prompt Google to post a job listing for a quantum researcher specifically focused on building AI-based discovery pipelines, systems where machine learning models help search through the enormous space of possible error correction codes, circuit designs, and optimization strategies far faster than human researchers manually testing configurations one at a time could ever manage. Then, less than a week before the two papers went public, Google separately announced it was launching its own internal initiative focused on neutral atom quantum computing, hiring Gila fellow Adam Kaufman to lead a new hardware team based in Boulder, Colorado, essentially signaling that Google itself saw the neutral atom approach, the same one Oratomic was betting everything on, as suddenly worth a serious, dedicated investment. This is the part that deserves sitting with for a second, because it's easy to skim past. AI wasn't used here to write a press release or summarize a paper. It was used as a genuine research accelerant inside one of the most mathematically demanding fields that exists, helping researchers search through combinatorially enormous design spaces of quantum error correction architectures faster than traditional trial and error theoretical work could manage. That's a meaningfully different use of AI than most of what gets breathlessly reported as an AI breakthrough. This wasn't a chatbot answering questions. It was AI functioning as a tool that appears to have genuinely compressed years of theoretical exploration into a matter of months. And the researchers who did it are not shy about saying so on the record. Now, why does any of this actually matter to you, beyond being an interesting story about clever physicists and their laser tweezers? Because the entire architecture of digital trust that the modern world runs on, your banking, your email, government communications, healthcare records, cryptocurrency, virtually every secure connection your browser makes depends on math problems that are currently too hard for classical computers to solve in any reasonable amount of time, but that a sufficiently capable quantum computer running Shor's algorithm could solve comparatively quickly. RSA encryption relies on the difficulty of factoring extremely large numbers into their prime components. Elliptic curve cryptography, the backbone of most modern HTTPS traffic, relies on a related but distinct hard math problem called the discrete logarithm problem. Classical computers, even the most powerful supercomputers on the planet, would take longer than the age of the universe to crack modern RSA 2048 encryption through brute force. That's not hyperbole, it's the entire basis for why the world trusts these systems with its most sensitive information. A cryptographically relevant quantum computer changes that math entirely, turning a computationally impossible problem into one that's merely difficult and time-consuming. This is why the security community has spent the last several years talking about something informally nicknamed Q-Day, the theoretical moment when a quantum computer capable of breaking current encryption standards actually comes online. Before this research, most projections placed Q-Day somewhere comfortably out past 2035, which is not coincidentally the deadline the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, set for organizations to fully transition to quantum-resistant encryption standards, a new generation of cryptographic algorithms specifically designed to remain secure even against quantum attacks, which NIST finalized in 2024. That 2035 date was never meant to be leisurely. Migrating the entire Internet's cryptographic infrastructure to new standards is an enormous, expensive, multi-year undertaking involving essentially every piece of hardware and software that touches encrypted communication. But it was, at least, a date organizations could plan around methodically. What this new research does is compress the runway. If a cryptographically relevant machine is achievable with tens of thousands of qubits, rather than a million, using an architecture that a well-funded startup can meaningfully pursue, rather than only the handful of tech giants with essentially unlimited resources, the timeline for Q-Day stops looking like a distant, comfortable horizon and starts looking like something that could plausibly arrive within this decade. There's also a specific, less obvious danger buried in this timeline shift that security researchers have been warning about for years, usually described as a harvest now, decrypt later attack. The idea is straightforward and honestly a little chilling once you sit with it. An adversary, whether a criminal organization or a state intelligence agency, doesn't need a working quantum computer today to benefit from stealing encrypted data today. They simply need to intercept and store encrypted traffic now, banking records, government communications, health data, anything with long-term sensitivity, and wait. Once a cryptographically relevant quantum computer eventually comes online, all of that previously unreadable, harvested data becomes instantly decryptable. Under the old comfortable million qubit estimate, data harvested today might have stayed safe for decades, simply because the computer capable of cracking it didn't exist yet. Under this new, dramatically compressed estimate, the shelf life of that safety margin just got a lot shorter, which is precisely why an organization like Cloudflare, whose entire business is securing internet traffic for a meaningful chunk of the web, didn't wait around. They moved their internal preparation deadline up by 6 years within days of these papers becoming public. It's worth being clear-eyed, though, about what this research does and does not prove, because there's a difference between a resource estimate and a working machine, and conflating the two is exactly the kind of exaggeration that erodes trust in real science reporting. What Oratomic and the Google team published are theoretical and architectural resource estimates, detailed peer-reviewable calculations showing that a machine with these specifications should, in principle, be able to run these attacks in these timeframes. Nobody has actually built a 20,000 qubit neutral atom quantum computer yet. Oratomic itself, which formally launched as a company on March 31st, 2026, right alongside the publication of this research, is still in the process of trying to build toward that goal, not announcing that it already has. A quantum researcher at UC Berkeley, Umesh Vazirani, described the question of which underlying hardware approach, atoms, superconducting circuits, or photons, will ultimately prove easiest to scale up as the field's million-dollar question, and that question remains genuinely open. Google, IBM, and Microsoft are all pursuing different underlying architectures, superconducting qubits for Google's Willow processor and IBM's roadmap, topological qubits for Microsoft's more speculative approach, and now neutral atoms getting serious renewed attention from multiple players at once. Nobody has definitively won this race. What changed on March 30th wasn't proof of an existing machine. It was proof that the finish line is dramatically closer than the field's own working assumptions had it, which is arguably just as consequential, because it reshapes how urgently everyone downstream, governments, banks, standards bodies, needs to move. It's also worth putting this in context of who else is racing toward the same finish line, because Oratomic is a serious new entrant, not the only player on the board. Google's Willow processor represents the superconducting qubit approach, physically etched circuits cooled to near absolute zero, an architecture Google has invested in for years and continues to push forward, including the Quantum Echo's work aimed at using quantum processors to study molecular structure for drug discovery. IBM has its own aggressive roadmap targeting what it calls verified quantum advantage, a milestone where a quantum computer demonstrably outperforms the best classical supercomputers on a genuinely useful task by the end of the same year. Microsoft has bet on a more exotic and, so far, more speculative approach involving topological qubits, engineered to be inherently more resistant to noise at the physical level rather than relying purely on error correction overhead to compensate for fragility, though that approach has also drawn more skepticism from parts of the research community about how close it actually is to working at scale. IonQ has pursued trapped ion qubits, a cousin of the neutral atom approach that trades raw processing speed for exceptional stability. And now, with Oratomic's launch and Google's own new neutral atom hardware team in Boulder, the neutral atom approach that had been a comparatively quieter corner of the field is suddenly attracting some of the most serious new investment and talent in all of quantum computing. Nobody knows yet which of these architectures will actually get there first, and it's entirely possible more than one approach ends up crossing the finish line for different kinds of problems, since quantum simulation, drug discovery, and code breaking don't necessarily all reward the same underlying hardware design. But the fact that multiple well-funded, deeply credentialed teams are now converging rapidly on similar timelines, rather than each quietly pursuing separate decades-long roadmaps in relative isolation, is itself a signal worth paying attention to. The market response tells you how seriously the people with the most at stake are taking this. Oratomic didn't stay a quiet research spin-off for long. Barely a few months after launching, the company closed a $300 million Series A funding round, led by major venture firms including Arch Venture Partners, Spark Capital, and Khosla Ventures, putting it among the largest early-stage deep tech raises of the year. The founding team reads like a who's who of the field pulled from Caltech, Harvard, Amazon, and Google, including Manuel Endres and John Preskill, researchers who have spent decades on the theoretical foundations this entire result builds on. When investors move that fast and that large behind a research result this specific, it's a strong signal that the technical community isn't treating this as hype. It's treating it as a genuine, if still early, shift in the roadmap toward practical quantum computing, one with obvious and enormous commercial as well as security implications. So where does this actually leave things, practically speaking, for the rest of us? The good news is that the response to this kind of threat has already been underway for years, just not with quite this level of urgency. NIEST's post-quantum cryptographic standards, finalized back in 2024, exist specifically to give the world a set of encryption algorithms believed to remain secure even against quantum attacks, and organizations serious about long-term data security have already been migrating toward them. What this research does is turn that migration from a background, decade-scale project into something that increasingly reads like an active race against a clock that just got noticeably shorter. Expect to see more companies following Cloudflare's lead, pulling their internal timelines forward. Expect governments, particularly agencies handling classified or long shelf life sensitive data, to accelerate their own post-quantum transitions even further. And expect the next 12 to 18 months to bring a wave of follow-up research, both trying to independently verify Oratomic and Google's resource estimates, and trying to actually build toward the qubit counts these papers describe. Because right now, the theoretical roadmap exists in a way it simply didn't a year ago. And in a field like this, once the roadmap exists, funding and talent tend to follow it fast, often faster than regulators, standards bodies, or the general public manage to catch up with. It's worth being clear-eyed about the parts of this story that remain genuinely uncertain, because that's part of what separates a real, trustworthy account of a breakthrough from an overhyped one. Resource estimates in quantum computing have a track record of being optimistic. Building a stable, coherent system with 10 or 20,000 qubits Even with the improved error correction approach this research describes, involves enormous unsolved engineering challenges around laser control precision, atom trapping stability, and simply keeping thousands of individually addressed atoms behaving predictably at once, none of which this research claims to have already solved. Skeptics within the field have pointed out that theoretical resource estimates have been revised, sometimes upward again, as engineering realities intrude on clean paper calculations before. It's entirely possible the real number ends up being somewhat higher than 10,000 once actual hardware constraints are factored in more fully. But even accounting for that reasonable skepticism, a downward revision of 50 to 100 times, verified independently by two separate teams using different methods and arriving at broadly similar conclusions within days of each other, is not the kind of thing serious researchers or serious cybersecurity organizations like Cloudflare dismiss as noise. That combination, genuine engineering uncertainty about the exact timeline, paired with high confidence that the timeline moved meaningfully closer, is exactly why the responsible reaction has been urgency without panic, accelerating preparation rather than either ignoring the result or treating encryption as already broken. There's a bigger thread running underneath this story too, one worth pulling on before we wrap up, because it says something about where large swaths of scientific research might be heading generally, not just quantum computing. This wasn't AI generating a discovery out of nothing, and it wasn't a chatbot spitting out a research paper. It was AI functioning as a genuine accelerant on top of deep human expertise, letting researchers, who already understood the theoretical landscape, search through the space of possible solutions dramatically faster than manual work alone would have allowed. That's a meaningfully different and arguably more significant story than most of what gets labeled an AI breakthrough in a given news cycle. If this pattern holds, and researchers across other technical fields increasingly report the same kind of dramatic compression, years of theoretical groundwork collapsing into months, this may turn out to be one of the more consequential and least discussed effects of the current wave of AI development. Not flashy chatbot demos, but a quiet acceleration happening inside the hardest, most technical corners of physics and mathematics research. Corners most people never think to check. For now, the honest summary looks like this. A real peer-reviewable, AI-assisted research result just cut the estimated hardware requirements for breaking modern internet encryption by somewhere between 50 and 100 times, from a comfortably distant 1 million qubits down to a plausible tens of thousands. Nobody has built that machine yet, and there's real, open engineering uncertainty about exactly how fast anyone will. But the security world's own risk calculus has already visibly shifted, with a major internet infrastructure company moving its preparation deadline up by 6 years within days of the paper's landing. Whether Q-Day arrives in 5 years or 15, the runway just got shorter than almost anyone in the field was planning for a month ago. And the fact that AI played a direct, acknowledged role in getting there is exactly the kind of detail that's easy to miss in a headline, but genuinely changes how you should think about what's coming next, and how quickly the systems you rely on every single day may need to change to keep up with it. If this is the first time you're hearing about Oratomic, you're not behind. This genuinely broke in real time over the last few months, and it's still actively unfolding as the company works to raise more capital and actually build toward the qubit counts these papers describe. It's also worth remembering that this isn't purely an abstract institutional problem playing out somewhere far above your daily life. Every password manager, every banking app, every messaging service you trust with private conversations, every medical record stored in a system somewhere, ultimately rests on the same handful of cryptographic assumptions this research just put pressure on. Most of that shift will happen invisibly, in the background, as companies and governments migrate their systems to quantum-resistant standards over the coming years, the same way most people never noticed the internet's last major cryptographic transition either, back when web browsers quietly swapped out older encryption standards for stronger ones, without most users ever realizing a change had happened at all. But the pace of that migration now matters in a way it simply didn't a year ago, and it's worth understanding why, rather than just scrolling past another quantum computing headline that sounds impressive without meaning anything concrete. Keep an eye on this one, because unlike a lot of quantum computing news that promises a breakthrough decades out, this is a story with an active, compressed timeline, real money behind it, and real consequences for anyone who relies on encrypted data, which, whether you think about it day to day or not, is essentially everyone. Let me know down below what you think this means for how fast we actually need to take the post-quantum transition seriously, and whether you think the next big jump in this field comes from better hardware, or from AI doing what it just did here again, somewhere nobody's watching. Yet, quietly compressing years of theoretical work into months, long before the rest of us ever hear about it.